Hello and welcome to Women in Writing. My name is Kelly Green and I am one of the executive members of Fabian Women's Network, and I'll be chairing tonight with Emily Batchelor, who is Women's Officer for the Young Fabians. So we're delighted to have you all here. We wanted to do this event because we feel that women do not get enough attention in literature, whether it's historical literature or current political writing. And we were very driven by Virginia Woolf's statement that for most of history, Anonymous was a woman. So we wanted to put on this event really to just raise attention to all the many women in our history, and particularly our political history, who have changed our political lives and who aren't given credit. So we've got a fantastic panel tonight with us. We've got MPs Rachel Reeves and Yvette Cooper. We have Dr. Samara Linton, and I'm going to give her special attention just now that she has a book out today, which she has written about MP Diane Abbott. So congratulations. And if anyone wants to order that book, it literally came out today. And then we have Kafayat Okanlawon, who is the editor of a book called This Is Us, Black British Women and Girls. And one thing we've absolutely noticed, Emily and myself doing the research for this tonight, is there is a massive deficit in stories about women of colour in our political history. There absolutely is a deficit. So we really hope we're going to see more of those books in the future. And we're really pleased that we can draw attention to that tonight. So I'm going to go to Rachel first. As everyone watching will know, Rachel is the Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, and she's MP for Leeds West. But she's also author of a biography of Labour politician Alice Bacon, who was Baroness Bacon, which is titled Alice in Westminster. And she's also the writer of one of my absolute favourite books, Women of Westminster, which tells the story of many great political women. So, Rachel, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Kelly. I'm going to try and time myself actually so that I don't bang on for too long, because I'm at risk of speaking for the whole hour. So I'll start then with Alice Bacon and how I got into writing. When I was elected as the MP for Leeds West in 2010, I was the first woman for 40 years to serve as an MP for my city. For the 40 years before that, all 8 constituencies in Leeds were represented by white men. And so when I did my sort of acceptance speech when I was elected, I paid tribute to my immediate predecessor, but I also paid tribute to Alice Bacon, who's the only other woman to represent a Leeds constituency before me. And she served as the MP for Leeds North East and then Leeds South East between 1945 and 1970. She was a really remarkable woman. She was the daughter of a coal miner. She made her first political speech aged 16 at the Normanton Working Men's Club in Yvette's constituency. And she went on to become a school teacher and then a member of the Labour National Executive Committee and then a member of Parliament. And she served as a minister under Harold Wilson's government. But very, very few people have heard of her. And when I got elected, I wanted to find out a bit more about her, what battles she had fought, how she became an MP in the first place. And one of the most interesting interviews I did was with Gerard Kaufman, who went on to be an MP himself, but had grown up in her constituency of Leeds North East. And his parents had been at the selection meeting in the 1930s when she was selected as the candidate. And I said, well, how did she get to be the parliamentary candidate, Gerard? And he said to me, what you have to remember, Rachel, is Leeds North East was a very safe Conservative seat. If the local Labour Party members had a thought there was any chance of returning a Labour member of Parliament, they wouldn't have selected Alice, nor indeed any other young woman. And so in many ways, Alice's arrival in Parliament in 1945 was a bit of an accident of history. The Labour landslide of 1945 ushered in many Labour MPs, but it also ushered in a record number of women. So after writing that book, I felt, like Kelly said right at the beginning, that so many remarkable women have been written out of our political history, and I felt a little bit of a duty, as I expect that others are going to say this evening, to write some of them back in. And so that's where my book, Women of Westminster, came from. And it was published in 2019, at the centenary, the first woman taking her seat in the House of Commons. It was 4 years after that. Nancy Astor was the first woman to take her seat in the House of Commons. It was 4 years later, in 1923, that the first 3 Labour women took their seats in Parliament, and that was Margaret Bonfield, Susan Lawrence and Dorothy Jewson. And this evening, in the time I've got available, I'm just going to say something about Margaret Bonfield, then Ellen Wilkinson, and then Barbara Castle, because for me, really, they were probably the heroes for me of the book. Margaret Bonfield was born in Chard in Somerset, and she was the 10th of 11 children. She grew up in poverty, and when she was 14, she left school and moved from Somerset to Brighton, where she worked as a shop assistant. And as well as experiencing poverty growing up, she also experienced a great deal of exploitation in the workforce. And one evening, she was eating a dinner of fish and chips wrapped in a newspaper, and she saw in the newspaper an advert for the Shop Workers Union, and she decided, because of what she was having to put up with at work, to join that union. She went on to become its Assistant General Secretary. She was the first ever woman to speak at Trades Union Congress. In 1923, she was one of the first 3 Labour women to take her seat in Parliament, and in 1929 she became the first ever British woman to serve in a cabinet. And so she, again, a woman who many people, even in our party, and women in our party wouldn't have heard of, is a real trailblazer for all of us. The second woman I want to mention this evening is Ellen Wilkinson. Ellen was elected the following year in 1924, first of all in Middlesbrough, and then later she served as the MP for Jarrow. And it was in Jarrow, really, that she came to public attention for leading the Jarrow Crusade from Jarrow 300 miles down to London in protest of the mass unemployment in her constituency because of the closure of the steelworks and shipbuilding. And she was an incredibly flamboyant and extravagant and just in every possible way remarkable woman. But before she was elected, women tended to wear to Parliament a very dull outfits, black suits, black dresses, and Ellen turned up, and she wore, for the first time she went into Parliament, an emerald green dress. And Nancy Astor, the Conservative MP, tried to encourage her to dress more soberly to Parliament, and it was to no avail. And she very much, like Barbara Castle, who followed her, used the sort of sense of drama to draw attention to herself and her brand of quite fiery left politics. Ellen Wilkinson served in 1945 as the second woman to serve in a cabinet under Clement Attlee as Education Secretary. And those really were the 3 years that she held that role, remarkable years in terms of the transformation of young people's education. She set about rebuilding schools after the Second World War. She raised the school leaving age from 14 to 16 against huge opposition, including from within our own party, who did not see education as a priority, given all of the other things that the Labour government in 1945 had to contend with. But she argued that our young people, particularly working class young people, had already missed out on so much education because of the war. She was determined to ensure that they got a fresh chance in 1945. And she also introduced the first ever free school milk at schools. And of course, 30 years later, Margaret Thatcher, as Education Secretary, took that away. And I think that's just one example of the difference between a Labour government and a Conservative government. We introduced free milk, and Conservatives snatched it away 30 years later. Ellen Wilkinson died much too soon. She died in her 50s, just 3 years after becoming Education Secretary. It was a huge loss to the country and to the Labour movement, and we'll never know what she could have gone on to achieve. The third person who I want to mention this evening is Barbara Castle. And when I sent the first draft of my book to my publisher, she said, you've got to cut down some of this stuff on Barbara Castle, Rachel. This could be a whole book. And so I've got in my drawers at home pages and pages of research and work that I did on Barbara Castle that had to be taken out because of room. And I think that just goes to show really the impact that she had on me when I was writing this book. And probably even before I wrote it, I would have said that she was my hero for all sorts of reasons. I think probably most of all because of equal pay. And here we are in 2020, 50 years after the Equal Pay Act, and we still don't have equal pay for men and women. But when she was Secretary of State under Harold Wilson in that really, you know, pioneering governments of the 60s and 70s. She pushed for so much change for women. Back then, the average pay of an industrial woman worker was just 50% of that of a man doing the same job. And the Dagenham Ford workers, of course, came to her and asked for her to do something about it. She took legislation through Parliament, and for 30 years, you know, women in Parliament had campaigned on equal pay, actually in many cases across the political spectrum, but certainly starting with Edith Summerskill, who had been a Labour MP during the 1930s and 40s. And it took having a Labour Secretary of State, the fourth woman to serve in a cabinet, to get that onto the statute books. But as well as equal pay, Barbara Castle was also responsible for introducing the first ever child benefit, but also the changes to the pensions that benefited women in the form of SERPs. So I think it's fair to say that more than perhaps any woman in Parliament over the last 100 and a bit years, Barbara Castle has made more difference to the lives of women than anyone else. And in fact, Yvette, when she was an MP, took forward some of that work with the first ever family tax credits and child tax credits. And one of the themes of my book is about women making men in power take notice of issues that affect women. And when family allowances were introduced in the 1940s, child benefit in the 1960s, and then the family tax credits in the 1990s, on all occasions, the argument was that it would be much simpler to pay it through the paycheck to the man rather than directly to the woman. And all of those occasions, it took Labour women arguing that it would make most difference and it would make the change that we wanted it to see as Labour governments if it was paid directly to the mother. And on all of those occasions, we won that battle. It's the battle we didn't win in when the universal credit was introduced under a Conservative government, which is paid to the main earner and not the main carer. I'll stop at that point because I think I've exhausted my 10 minutes, but the book really is meant to rewrite some amazing women back into our political history. Oh, now it's beeping. To rewrite some amazing women back into our political history, and I hope to inspire a future generation of women to put themselves forward for public service and political office by showing the change that we can make when we work together, sometimes over years and years to deliver it. But every woman I write about in this book, I believe, has changed the lives of women in the country, and for that we should all be grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. I think you raised a really good point about Barbara Castle, because for me, I was really familiar with her work on equal pay. And I was really shocked when I read her book, Fighting All the Way, just what a small part of her career that was. It was only a very small part of the book, because there's so much more to her. And, you know, perhaps in the future, we should do a whole event just on Barbara Castle, because we really can't lose those stories that she brought us. Can I just say, for anyone watching, if you want to ask any questions or make any comments, please use the Q&A and we'll go to them later. And if you are tweeting, if you can tweet #WomenInWriting, that will be lovely. So we're going to go over to Yvette now. Now, Yvette is, and I hope I say this right, the Labour MP for Normanton, Pontefract and Castleford and Knottingley, possibly the longest name for a constituency, I suspect. And she's also chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee. And she's the author of a book called She Speaks, which is a collection of inspiring speeches by women, which has just gone into paperback. It's a fantastic book, really easy just to pick up when you need a bit of inspiration for whatever reason. So I heartily recommend that book. So Yvette, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and thank you so much for organising this as well. So mine it's a celebration of women speaking as well as women writing, and I put the book together, to be honest, because I was just fed up of women's voices being sidelined and figured it's time to fight back. So it's a celebration of women's voices through the ages, across the world as well, and just amazing women's speeches from different kinds of situations and circumstances. And I think I mean, you've heard Rachel give some really inspiring stories of some of the women whose really shoulders we stand on today and the changes that they've made. And as an MP, of course, it's your job to speak, to make speeches different times. I had at different times sort of looked for inspiration for, you know, making speeches. You know, what's the best way to persuade people to say something that people will listen to? And what really struck me was how hard it was to find the great speeches that women might have made, how they just disappear. So if you look at the anthologies of speeches, you'd find that there was a 1995 big one of historic speeches, the Penguins books of speeches, only 5% were made by women. And the recent one, even recently, you'd get, there's a actually otherwise very good, interesting book on speeches called When They Go Low, We Go High, a quote from an amazing Black woman speaker, Michelle Obama, whose speech then didn't even feature in the book on speeches. In fact, there were no women's speeches in it at all. So there's a sort of sense of women's speeches not being noted in anthologies, but actually it's a much broader problem than that. Too often women's voices just get sidelined, and still very often we'll see platforms where there are no women speakers at conferences, or where there's research that shows women less likely to speak in a conference call or in a Zoom call or in other kinds of public forums. And the reason, the sort of really startling reason that the Penguin anthology from 1995 gave as to why they'd included so few women's speeches, well, they said there are three reasons. One is that until the mid-20th century, few women featured on the great stages. Another, given by some feminists, is that women have wanted no part in the macho game of domination by speech. And the third is physical. Women's voices are not by nature made for oratory. They are not deep enough. So those were the reasons, even just not so many years ago, were being given, all of which, of course, are nonsense. And the interesting one is the comment about, well, let's only look at the speeches from the great stages, because actually what you find is there are some amazing stories about women who may not have been making a speech as a prime minister or a president 100 years ago, but they were making speeches around public meetings, around town halls, all across the country, campaigning. So you could go back to the suffragettes who toured the country making speeches at public meetings, or the abolitionists, Sojourner Truth, whose speech I included in the book, talking about the need to abolish slavery in the States and going around to public meetings all over the country. So they were building movements, even if they weren't embodying moments as grand leaders. And so that's why what I wanted to do was to bring together some of those examples from throughout history, some of those public voices, some of the people to celebrate. And actually it's even more needed now than ever, when if you look at the public voices that we hear now, if you think through the coronavirus crisis, the incredibly important moment where not only the decisions being made, but also communication in a public health crisis is so important. Yet of the 93 speeches that were made by ministers, government ministers, at press conferences during the coronavirus crisis, 89 of them were made by men. So where were the women ministers? Where were they? Where were their voices? Where were their voices in the decisions that were being made? But where were their voices in the communication and the debates with the public as well? And ironically, of course, two of the world leaders who've been most applauded for the way they have handled the difficult coronavirus crisis have been Jacinda Ardern and Angela Merkel, both in different ways, communicating with honesty, clarity, and building trust in the way that they talk about the difficult crisis, as well as getting so many of the decisions right as well. So much need to do this, so many examples to choose from stories across the world, because and across the world, but also across history too. And recognising too that, of course, that when you look for those voices, women disappear, but you also find, of course, that Black and minority ethnic women disappear completely, and voices throughout so many different situations and circumstances. So we tried to find speeches that were from Michelle Obama to Julia Gillard, from Diane Abbott to Greta Thunberg to Kavita Krishnan, ones that people would have heard of, very much like Baudelaire or Elizabeth I, or more recently, Jo Cox's more in common speech that's so powerfully quoted, but also speeches that people might not have heard of, like Eva Kor, who's a survivor of Auschwitz, who makes a remarkable speech, describing her experiences, but also her personal journey of forgiveness as well, just remarkable to read. Donna Strickland, who's a Nobel Prize winner for physics, makes this speech about physics being fun. Or Kavita Krishnan, who is an activist in Delhi at the time when there was some of the awful rape and murder of a woman on a bus. And she makes this really powerful speech where she says, "Don't you dare tell us how to dress, when to go out at night, in the day, or how to walk, or how many escorts we need." And Rachel talked about Barbara Castle and the campaign for equal pay. I did include a Barbara Castle speech, but actually I included a much later one when she was actually almost 90, and she made this speech where she ends up having a row with the chair at Labour Party conference, and the chair just backed off. The red light had gone on, but there was no way Barbara Castle was stopping. She was making her speech, and everybody just listened and applauded. But I chose as well to mark the equal pay a speech by a trade unionist called Joan O'Connell, who I'd never heard of before. I just sort of came across her when I was searching for other speeches. And she made a speech that is immortalised, or a version of it, in Made in Dagenham, the film, where Rita stands up and makes a speech at the TUC conference. But actually it was modelled on a trade unionist, who in fact was from Ireland, who made a speech about equal pay and challenging the trade unionists at the TUC. And she said, "For too long, the women workers of this country have been fobbed off by pious resolutions, cosy chats and cups of tea in the House of Commons. Barbara Castle has equal pay for equal worth. Why should not the rest of her sex have it? We want more than the promise of a dream." And brilliant speech, but none of us had heard of it until they put it together in the film, and then went searching for it. But the disturbing thing that I found actually researching for the book was how many attempts there had been to silence women through the ages as well. So Boudica was attacked and her daughters raped because she dared to stand up against Roman authority. Josephine Butler, who was this Victorian campaigner against the prostitution laws, the steel rape prostitution laws that were used to oppress women at the time, she had to escape from a burning barn in my constituency, in Knottingley, when she had been targeted by opponents she was campaigning during the by-election in Pontefract at the time, trying to put pressure on all the candidates to get the law changed. Benazir Bhutto, who I'm including in the speech, obviously, who was assassinated by the Taliban, and then Malala, who was also the target of attempted murder by the Taliban many years later. Wangari Maathai, who was a Kenyan Nobel Prize winner, who was brutally beaten by the police campaigning as an environmentalist, and Diane Abbott, who Samara obviously will talk about, whose Windrush speech I've included in the book, and who has been the target of more abuse and hatred and vitriol than any other MP in Parliament. And again, you see the women being targeted by misogyny to silence them, but also women who are Black, Asian, ethnic minority getting the additional abuse and targeting and attempts to silence people. And Lilit Maritasurian, who is a trans woman in Armenia, made a speech, really powerful speech, in the Armenian parliament, but then had to go into hiding as a result of the threats to her life as a result of speaking out. And so I wanted to bring those speeches together because they were all women who have stood up and refused to be silenced, who have made amazing speeches and spoken out in incredible ways. And I wanted to just finish with Audre Lorde, because she was the most inspirational speaker that I found of all of the speeches. And she talks honestly about how actually silence doesn't protect you, and the need to keep speaking out, but also recognizing that it can be really hard to do so, that you feel really vulnerable when you do so, and that we should recognize that, and that is part of what it is to speak out, is to feel vulnerable. And she said, on the cause of silence, each one of us draws her own fear of contempt, of censure, of some judgment or recognition, of challenge, of annihilation, But most of all, I think we fear the visibility without which we also cannot truly live. And she says, that visibility which makes you most vulnerable is also our greatest strength, because the machine will try to grind us into dust anyway, whether or not we speak. We can sit in our corners mute forever while our sisters are wasted, while our children are distorted and destroyed, while our earth is poisoned. We can sit in our safe corners as mute as bottles, and we will still be no less afraid. And she says, my silences had not protected me, your silence will not protect you. And that was a speech by Audre Lorde, who in her own words was a black lesbian poet from writing in the 1970s. And that was part of a speech she gave in Chicago in the 1970s. Yet those words seem still so powerful today. That's why I wanted everybody to be able to share them, to be able to read them, and for them to inspire more women to speak out.
Thank you, Yvette. I think you summed up so much of what Emily and I wanted to convey in this event tonight. So many of those speeches are so inspiring and so important. And when you were talking about silencing today, I was put in mind of Ellie Reeves, who happens to be Rachel's sister, but is also MP for Lewisham, being told today, albeit by a woman, that she was too emotional. I don't imagine that's ever been said to a man, or Rosanna Allen Khan being told to watch her tone. This is always that women are silenced, or people attempt them to be silent, and that really came to mind while you were speaking. So we're going to move across now to Dr. Samara Linton. She co-edited a book called The Colour of Madness, which was an anthology exploring Black, Asian, minority ethnic mental health. She was awarded Best New Journalist in 2016, and she is the co-author of Diane Abbott, the Authorised Biography, which is published today. So Samara, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Yes, Diane Abbott, the Authorised Biography came out today, and that's been my baby for the last year or so, and it's been an absolute privilege to work on this biography. My background is not in history, it's not in even writing per se, and I found writing while I was at university, and it was a way to make my voice heard. And it's incredible that, you know, kind of I've had the opportunity to work on the story of a woman who has never really known how to be silent. And it's been really transformative, I think, for me as a Black woman, as a Jamaican woman, as Diane is, to have been part of this process in documenting her life and her political career. So, I mean, Diane is known just for being the first Black woman member of Parliament. She's the longest serving Black MP, and she has been a part of our country's history for 33 years, our political history. And it's very interesting, a lot of the things that Yvette said about visibility, and with visibility coming vulnerability, but also the ability and the opportunity to make considerable change and considerable influence. And I'm just going to talk through, I guess, some of the things that stood out for me in terms of researching and learning about the life of Diane, what this writing process has meant for me, and what I think a lot of us can take away from it. So Diane, as she frequently says, she is the child of these immigrants you've heard so much about. And, you know, she started saying that back in the 80s, and that statement is still as provocative today as it was then. Her parents were of the Windrush generation. They were a nurse and a welder. And for Diane, like for many other immigrants, education was extremely important for her and for her family. And that's, in many ways, she always attributes her education to giving her a level pegging and allowing her to be in the position that she is today. Diane's often known as a troublemaker. She's often known as, you know, part of the dissenting left and the awkward squad, and, you know, the thought that someone who's consistently speaking up and consistently willing to go against the status quo has kind of contributed to her being painted in this light. But it's also the reason why she intrigues so many of us, and it's also the reason why time and time again she has been re-elected. So in terms of writing, I've always been interested in the character and the person behind these big political icons. And I've tried throughout this book to weave in the pieces of Diane's character that kind of shape her policies and shape where she is today and the person who she is today. And I think it's interesting to note that even though today Diane's really recognised for speaking up about racial injustice and being very vocal about racism and issues of immigration, her first passion was feminism. And when she was a university student, you know, she was in the middle of a lot of really interesting and lively debates about feminism and women's rights. It was at a time where she went to Cambridge University, and the colleges, not all colleges admitted women, and they were still campaigning for women to be allowed to attend equally to men at Cambridge. And you know, she tried to engage herself in feminism and women's politics and women's issues, but found a disconnect between her experiences of womanhood and the focus that was presented at the time while she was at university. And unfortunately, you know, 30 odd years later, that feeling is still very relevant and still very familiar to many women of colour who do try to engage with gender politics. And I think Diane very quickly learnt that as a Black woman, she wasn't able to disentangle, you know, racial politics and gender politics. Those two came together in her one body, and it shaped her politics in those ways. And I think we see this really, really clearly in terms of, you know, one of the most notable rebellions that she had was against cuts to single parents' welfare. And for her, this was not just about, you know, women's rights and the rights for women to be the primary caregiver if they chose to be so, but also her own experience of being among people for whom single parenting is not uncommon. And then she herself went on to be a single mum and had managed to maintain a career in politics as a single parent, and has spoken about, you know, the challenges of that and what that's involved. She brought her infant son into Parliament because she couldn't sort out childcare. You know, very, very relatable, very human experiences that have shaped, you know, this icon that we see today. And I think there's something that's very interesting about Diane, is that she feels that the idea of family has been co-opted by the right, and actually so much of her politics involves, you know, the left reclaiming and taking back the idea of family. And again, she links this to her identity as someone of Jamaican heritage and of West Indian heritage. And again, an example of the two being inseparable for her, because, you know, when you're an immigrant, you move to a new country, often the only people who you can rely on will be your family and your community. And she gives the example of a system called partner system, where it's very common across the Caribbean, where every month or so, everyone will put in a certain amount of money into a pot, and everyone will then take turns taking that money out of the pot. Because, you know, at the time, people were struggling to get loans from the bank, they were struggling to get access to finances and financial help. And these immigrants developed this system of looking after each other and caring for each other in a very practical and financial way. And for her, you know, family isn't necessarily, well, we know family isn't like the nuclear family or this traditional, you know, 2.5 kids or whatever they say it is anymore. But for her, family is community. And I think that's been very, very evident in how she has approached her politics in the years that have followed. And again, I think another thing that Diane's very well known for is her speeches. And I'm just thinking, the Windrush one was incredible. I'm thinking back to the speech that she gave, which was completely unplanned and impromptu, when she was speaking up against the proposals for 42-day limits on the detention of terror suspects without charge. And she'd been campaigning about it and trying to, you know, get people to vote. But that speech that she gave that day was, you know, it wasn't meant to be by her. And she stood up and she made an incredible speech that won her loads of awards. And I find it very interesting because so often, you know, there are attempts to paint her as being unintelligent and unable to communicate. And then you go and you look at and you listen to, and you read these incredible speeches and you read these incredible documents that she's written, these articles and these arguments, and you realize what a disservice has been done to her because of this picture that's been painted of her. And you know, we know so much of this is sexualized and racialized, and even in terms of the kind of abuse that she gets, so much of it mentions the fact that she's a woman and a Black woman. And I think that her longevity, her tenacity, the fact that she's still here, probably more than anything, has shaped the way in which we now view women in politics and the ability to survive and thrive in politics. You know, last year we had the most diverse group of MPs ever elected, and you can't help but think about the fact that for so many years, she was the only Black woman in that House of Commons. And she was alone, but she kept going. And then she was joined at some points by Una King and all these other people, but it's only very, very recently where we've seen diversity in terms of ethnicity and in terms of sexuality and gender, and, you know, these things becoming more the norm than the exception. And I think Diane has been a part of that legacy and a part of that history. So she's as much a part of our kind of political history as she is a part of our political present. And for her to, you know, do that and be that significant person, that significant icon as a Black woman, in a time where, you know, Black histories have to be fought for, have to be often justified. We have to prove to people that we were here, yet, you know, that our histories didn't just begin 200 years ago, I think is very, very important, regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum. So I'll leave it there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Samara. So we're going to turn to our next speaker now. Now, as I said earlier, when we were looking into this event, we found that narratives, that books about Black women in politics were really completely missing. So it was fortuitous for us that Samara's book came out today, which was a complete coincidence. But so many other voices were missing. Even Shirley Chisholm, who was a politician in America, who stood for president, a Black politician in America, that even on her, there's very, very little writing. So we really wanted to make sure that we included, that we drew attention to the fact that those stories are completely missing from our narrative, but also to talk about that a bit more. So on that basis, we have invited Kafayat Okanlawon here. She's the editor of This Is Us, Black British Women and Girls, which tells the lived experiences from Black British women, basically retelling their stories of what it's like for them in Britain. So we really want to include that narrative. So Kafayat, over to you.
Hello, hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Kafayat Okanlawon, and as Kelly mentioned, I am the creator and editor of This Is Us, Black British Women and Girls. When I was invited to this event today and I was thinking about women in writing, initially I thought about books and books being published, and afterwards, when I really started to think about women in writing, I started actually thinking about journalists. I started to think about women who write poetry, women who write music, women who write speeches, and women who speak. And I think when I look at all of those sectors or those areas, those fields, I think we see what reflects in society, which is how patriarchy basically takes over and how misogyny takes over. And you see how constantly it is men who normally get the space, and then equally it is white men who get the space. I think when we look in the women's context, a lot of the time, though women don't have as much space, Black women definitely do not have spaces in any of those fields. And even when we do, it is usually because of our trauma. Usually people want us to talk about our sons being killed, talk about poverty, talk about distraught issues. And for me, with This Is Us, what I wanted to do is take that narrative away of having Black women just speak about race. Mm-hmm. So usually when women are brought onto a panel or talk, it's about what's the woman's perspective. When a Black woman is brought on, it's what's the Black woman's perspective. And ultimately we have more stories than just about race. Of course, race is very important to me, and I love speaking about being a Black woman because I love being a Black woman. However, I have other things that can contribute to the conversation. And for me, that's what This Is Us was about. So This Is Us is an anthology that has about, I should know the number, over 100, I'm just gonna say, over 100 Black British women and girls just speaking about their stories. And yes, there are stories about race and how racism has affected them, but also there's stories about women's experience in the healthcare system. There's stories about women's identity. One of my friends, she wrote about being a twin and what that means for her. one of my friends wrote about what her name means. And I think all of those things are important to Black women, but equally they're important to women and people generally. This book includes, as I mentioned, friends. It includes my mother, my grandmother, sisters. It includes my gym instructor. Literally, I thought, you know what, if I'm going to put a book together, I'm going to ensure that I bring other Black women along into this space. And so I try to get as many women as possible to be in this book, and actually really allow them to just have the space to be, allow them to just speak on their experiences without needing to bring the trauma or need to re-traumatize them. When I asked women, what would you like to speak about? Everyone said, what do you want me to speak about? And for me, that was very telling. For me, it was very telling that Black women in particular never have been afforded that space to talk about what they want to. Usually it's like, this is the criteria. You have to be this person have done this, have all these accolades to be able to be a part of a book, or to be able to, for people to hear your writing. With the book, everyone got the edited down version. As the editor, I got the full length version of the stories. And when I think about something that Yvette was speaking on, is that the power in those stories, like I wish everybody could have read the full stories and heard what everybody had to say, because the power in them was just beautiful, right? And for me, I think that's something that we should all do whenever we are in a space, try and bring people along and ensure that all their voices are heard in their voice. There was some issues with publishers around, you know what, we can't use those words. And for me, it was important that women spoke in the way in which they spoke. They use slang if they wanted to use slang. If they speak in patois, speak the patois, because that's who you are. So really bring your identity forward. When I think about women historically, especially like politically, I've noticed how even with Black women, our stories are very much Americanized. So when we think about Black women politically, historically, we go to, and with all respect, the Angela Davises. We speak about Assata Shakur, Sojourner Truth, who I love and dearly respect. But for me, there's something about Black British women politically, hearing their voices, hearing their stories, and hearing what they have to say. So when I saw Samara's book, I was in awe on some, yes, sis, I see you. Thank you for doing this work, because it's important. But equally, I guess there's a bigger question around the fact that Diane was the first Black woman in Parliament. And so we actually don't have many Black political leaders in Parliament who we actually can write stories about, and that in itself is very problematic. Equally, when thinking about the Americanization, is that the word, Americanization? Yeah, of Black women, I think there's also something about seeing how, you know, people talk about Martin Luther King, but no one talks about his wife, Coretta Scott King, and all the work she did behind the scenes in order for him to be able to do the work he does. Or the famous I Have a Dream speech. No one actually speaks about Mahalia Jackson, the woman who actually encouraged Martin Luther King to say said speech. And those things are missing out of history. Equally, when I think about Jamaican activist Marcus Garvey and his wife, Amy Garvey, she was the one who actually put his book together and published his book, but no one actually speaks about that. I do think we have a recent example in Michelle Obama, and though she tends to be missed out, I think that's a great example of seeing how it can be done. Her book was amazing. You know, her documentary on Netflix was amazing. And I think I hope we continue to document Black women's stories, but equally Black British women. And that's why for me, it was important to do Black British women and girls, as opposed to just hearing stories from American Black women. Also, I want to just speak about the lack of women in politics. And I mentioned before, the fact that we don't actually have any women to write stories about. We do at this point, but not enough. And the fact that we are only now getting the first Black women politicians book is amazing, and it's great, equally overdue. So once again, Samara, I salute you. And I just finally want to kind of speak about the Black British women here who are speaking up but are constantly being abused. I think it's very easy to romanticize the Assata Shakurs and Angela Davis, but I really want us to think about the women who are making noise here but tend to get abused. The women who are in the workplace speaking up, but they're the noisy, angry Black women. But it's okay to be like Angela Davis and be at the WOW Festival clapping away, but you're not listening to the Black women in your team at work. It doesn't make sense to me, right? So also, I just want to also just speak about and shout out Effie Hirsch, Angela Davis, Diane, Abbott, all the women doing the work here, making noise and constantly getting abused and still continuing. And for people to really understand that actually women in writing is bigger than just writing on us, just having a voice. In particular for Black women, it is about representation, because writing turns into films turns into what we see on our TV every day. So if we do not have Black women writers, we do not have great representation when it comes to actually what we watch. We don't have great representation when we think about school. When I think about my anthology in English literature, I don't remember there being any stories about any Black women. So I could not see myself. So what does that mean in terms for me and my psyche as a young Black woman growing up? And so, yeah, it is bigger than just writing and us being heard, but also about representation and identity and who we are in terms of how we grow. And how we live in this space and in these islands, in terms of knowing that, as Samara said, we are here, like we are really here. So yeah, that's what I've got to say.
Thank you so much for that. I'm really enjoying this evening. We're getting really good feedback from people commenting in, so thank you all so much. So I'm going to go across to Emily now, who's got who's taking charge of the questions.
Hi everyone. I'm loving this event so far. Thank you all so much for joining us. The first question is on the impact of abuse. So we've spoken about it a little bit already, and the impact that has on silencing women and women of colour in particular. We know recently with, the Black Lives Matter movement that if you are a Black woman tweeting, you're like 84% more likely than a white woman to be mentioned in an abusive or problematic tweet, which is just horrific. So I just wanted to get the thoughts of everyone on the state of things as they are now, and what we can do to support each other and really call out this abuse where we see it, and what more we can be doing as allies to everyone in this situation. I don't know who wants to start. Tamara?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. Just because on Twitter, I usually just post things about medicine and cats, things that I, just really things that I like. And since announcing that I am co-authoring this book, the kind of comments that I've been seeing under my posts is like appalling. Not surprising, because one of my friends told me, so she had previously interviewed Diane for an article and said that the amount of abuse that she got just for daring to interview Diane and give her a platform and to speak positively about her was immense. She was just receiving lots of bullying, lots of abusive comments online for days afterwards. And she was like, you're writing a book, so prepare yourself. And yes, it's just even being kind of associated with like an outspoken Black woman brings you abuse, much less being one. And me personally, I just block and delete. I don't engage with those kind of comments, but my friends and family read those comments, and it hurts them to see the way people will talk to me. And for me, I'm only going to speak about myself because I'm not going to speak on behalf of every Black woman. What I find useful is when my non-Black female peers who aren't maybe personally affected by the kind of vitriol that I'm seeing, when they step up as well. I think often people wait for you to be like, oh, this is awful, and then everyone will jump on the bandwagon and say it's awful as well. Surely you know it's awful. Like, why do you have to wait for me to have that kind of emotional response before you can just say things that are awful? In physical spaces, obviously we haven't really had much of those recently. In physical spaces, you see a lot of similar kind of, everyone's just really awkward when something inappropriate is said, and everyone kind of looks around and they look to you before they want to say anything. And I think there is purpose in not speaking over the person who's been targeted. If they are trying to say something for themselves, I don't think you should speak over somebody, but also it's more just the fatigue of having to continuously A, defend yourself, and then B, try and mobilize your quote unquote allies to speak to their peers and do the work as well. So for me, I block and delete, but also I kind of hold my friends up to a high standard, and I call them out and I'm like, you've seen this, why have you not said anything? Why have you not done anything?
Thank you, that's really helpful. And Anyone else want to chip in on this one, or shall I move to the next one? Rachel?
Yeah, no, I was trying to unmute myself. Yeah, I'll just add something. I interviewed Diane for my book, Samara, and it was a really powerful interview. And she spoke of you know, young women wanting to come and volunteer in her office, and at the beginning of the week or the fortnight say, you know, one day I really want to do what you're doing. It's so amazing. You're fantastic. And at the end of the week or fortnight saying, I've seen all the abuse you get, because, you know, they look at the emails, the social media, the stuff that's coming in, and they say, you know, it's great you're doing what you do and we need more people to, but I just couldn't do that. And she also sort of spoke about the change she'd seen in the, you say that it's the 33 years, isn't it, that she's been an MP now. And she said, you know, when she first got elected, if you wanted to, you know, to be abusive towards her, you had to, you know, get a piece of paper and a pen, write a letter, put it in an envelope, find the address, put a stamp, go to the post. I mean, it's quite an effort. Whereas now it's just, you know, at your fingertips. And it does mean that, and also I think it becomes normalised, because Chair, I interviewed Theresa May for my book, because it's about women across the political spectrum, and she sort of described it as, used to have the bloke at the end of the bar sort of muttering into his half pint, and everyone was thinking he was a bit of a weirdo, but then he puts stuff online, somebody likes it, someone shares it, and you suddenly think, actually lots of people think what I think, and you think, right, you've got a platform, but you've also, you're emboldened, you feel empowered to say those sorts of things. And I also just want to say something about what the purpose of all this abuse is. And it goes back to a point that Yvette made earlier. It is about silencing. And, you know, I don't know, Samara, what impact it has on you when you get that abuse online. You know, but I think for a lot of us, including me sometimes, if I know I'm going to get abuse, I just think, sometimes I just think, you know, I'm not going to bother saying that. I'm not going to speak out, because I don't want that sort of ton of crap to come down on me. And that's the whole purpose of it, because then if you decide not to do that radio interview or speak in the House of Commons or tweet that thing, then they have succeeded in silencing you. And it comes back to one of the quote that Yvette read out, that you're not, I'm not going to be able to put it as well, Yvette, as you put it, but you're not, if you're silent. Yes. Yeah, and I think that's a really, but sometimes it's not how you feel, is it? And another person I interviewed for my book was Rushanara Ali, and she said that she doesn't like speaking out about the abuse that she gets. She's, her and two others, Yasmin Qureshi and Shabana Mahmood, were the first three Muslim women elected to Parliament in 2010, you know, very recently. And she said she doesn't like speaking out about the abuse that she gets, because she's worried about the impact it will have on young Muslim women thinking of putting themselves forward. And so it's I think it's a difficult dilemma, that, but remember, the people who are putting out the abuse have one purpose, and that is to silence. The final thing I'll just say, I know I said the last one was, but the final thing is the stuff that starts online rarely finishes there. You know, it starts online and then it's in public meetings, and then, you know, you get what happened to Joe. And it spills out onto the street with tragic consequences. So that's why I think, Samara, you're absolutely right, that we should call this stuff out and call it out for what it is, and that's abuse, whether it's online or whether it is physical.
So I just very quickly add that I'd been struck, I chose about 40 speeches, different women, and chose them for all sorts of different reasons. And then when we look back afterwards, 2/3 of them had been in some ways subject to known abuse or threats, or violent threats, or violence itself. And probably it may well be that the others were as well, and that's through history. So it's not a new thing, the attempt to silence women. It's a different kind of silencing that you get now. And the insidious thing about the sort of online abuse and threats is, of course, that it reaches into your home, into the palm of your hand. It can be very personal and therefore affects people in different kinds of ways. And also it's the reinforcing. It's so much easier for people to just get reinforcement from other people, as Theresa May would have said, the other bloke at the end of the bar who might have been 100 miles away, but now they can connect. and so that can amplify things. I think there is a big challenge, though, to the social media companies on this. I mean, look, some of this is about what we can do, but, you know, we can't also, all of us, spend our entire times policing the, you know, internet, you know, looking for things to challenge, because that also makes you go completely mad as well. So it's the need to show each other solidarity and to challenge things, and also to think, you know what, why are we having to do this when actually a lot of this stuff is actually illegal? You know, some of this is hate crime, and it should be being taken down. And there is a real responsibility on social media companies. There's a responsibility on government to take the online harms bill, but then there's also a responsibility on social media companies, because some of it is not illegal, but it is silencing, and they should also be thinking about the harm that this does and the wider impact that this will have. And, you know, throughout this, we also still have to keep in mind, this is still a minority of voices. They are being amplified by social media, but they are still a tiny minority. They will get bigger if we let them, but if we don't, in the end, our voices should be stronger and more powerful if we speak up together.
We're actually run out of time, which is really frustrating because there's so much more we could talk about. And Emily and I have been talking through the chat, and we were saying how much we'd like to do some more events concentrating on individual historic female politicians. So it's something we're going to look at doing in the future. Before we end, if I could come to each panelist and ask if there is a book or any reading on any particular woman in politics you'd like to recommend. So I'm just going to quickly recommend Momentum by Mo Molan, which is a fantastic book and should absolutely be read. I'm big fans of all the books we've discussed tonight. I have to confess, I haven't read Samara's book yet, but I will do. I haven't managed to read the whole thing today. So if we could go, Kafayat, if we could go over to you first, and then we'll go round.
To who first? Oh, no.
Is this a book I'm recommending?
Yeah.
I would recommend a book called, what's it called? Heart of the Race, Black Women's Lives in Britain by Beverly Bryan, Stella Dadsey, and Susan Scaife. Basically, it's very similar to This Is Us. It's about Black British women's experiences, but it was written in the, don't quote me, I want to say 80s. But yeah, so yeah, that's a book I would recommend.
Fantastic. Samara, can we go to you?
Sure. I'm going to cheat and do two. The first one, everyone must read it, Girl, Woman, Other, Bernardine Evaristo. If you haven't read it already, I don't know what you're doing. And then the second one is by Ursa Daly Ward. She's a poet, and her book, The Terrible, is a mixture of memoir and poetry and prose, and it's just one of the most beautiful books I've ever read. And yeah, Black British woman. Yeah, Ursa Daly Ward, The Terrible.
Thank you. Yvette?
So I would chuck in Anne Perkins' biography of of Barbara Castle, Red Queen, or actually the poetry of Maya Angelou or Audre Lorde, because I included a poem by Maya Angelou in the book as well, just because she made it as a speech at the Clinton inauguration, and so any of that too.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And then over to you, Rachel.
I would choose Red Ellen by Laura Beers. And one of the, just one thing about writing women's history, and this is what Harriet Harman says this in her book, A Woman's Place. What's it called? Is that what it's called? Anyway, her autobiography, that women don't think that they are going to be making history, and so they don't keep papers, they don't keep notes. But in the case of Ellen Wilkinson, when she died, as I said earlier, when she was in her early 50s, her brother destroyed all of her papers, and because he didn't want prying into her personal life, because it was quite colourful, and as a result it took decades before somebody painstakingly pulled everything back together and wrote her biography. So, you know, we need more women to write their own stories and to write the stories of others, like Samara's just done. And Samara, I'm really looking forward to reading your book as well.
Fantastic. Emily, did you have a book you wanted to recommend?
Yeah, I was going to be like Samara and Chi. I was going to suggest Harriet Harman's book. It's a woman's work, but yeah, Woman's Place, women's work, same thing, which is really good. And also a novel that I read on lockdown was Homegoing by Yag Ghazi. It's amazing. It's an amazing book, and I'd really recommend anyone to pick it up and read it.
Brilliant. So thank you so much for our fantastic panel tonight. Thank you to Cecily, who's managed Twitter for us. And next week, we're having an event called Writing to be Heard, where we have 2 journalists coming. And we just want to encourage people to come along and learn a bit more about writing for the reasons that we've discussed, that it's so important for women to be recording what they're doing, knowing how to write, getting yourself heard, all that sort of thing. So please, everyone, if you've got questions you want to send in advance, that's fantastic. Otherwise, we'll be here the same time, 7 o'clock next week. So thank you so much for everyone for tuning in, and thank you to all our panelists for such an amazing, inspiring evening. Thank you.